1883, just outside Cologne, Germany.
Bloodlust, I just want him to die so he doesn't commit. Peter Kürten was free, and he was ready to act on every last...
Using a knife. He wanted the police to believe
a real-life vampire. Peter Kürten, known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf and the Dusseldorf Monster, plunged the city into darkness with a horrifying spree of slayings and intimate physical attacks in 1929. But his sinister legacy traces back to a past rife with arson, attempted slayings, and unspeakable violence. Branded by Carl Berg as the king of the carnal perverts, Kürten's gruesome acts led to his conviction on 9 counts of slaying and 7 counts of attempted slaying.
One of his deranged fantasies, bringing about a coup de grace in his life of crime.
Sentenced to die by beheading in April 1931, he met his end at 48, extinguishing his reign of terror but leaving behind a chilling aura of fear in Dusseldorf. Dubbed the Vampire of Dusseldorf for his macabre habit of attempting to drink his victims' blood, and the Dusseldorf Monster for the savagery he inflicted upon them, Kürten struck terror into the hearts of all who crossed his path. Beginnings. Born into poverty and brutality on May 26, 1883, in Mulheim am Rhein, Kürten's childhood was marred by the horrors of hurt and neglect. Raised in a squalid apartment by alcoholic parents, he witnessed his father's sadistic beatings and the torment inflicted upon his own family. As a boy, Kürten displayed signs of a disturbed mind, finding companionship in the twisted acts of a sadistic dog catcher. Together, they reveled in the torture and slaying of innocent animals, a precursor to Kürten's descent into darkness. Subjected to relentless cruelty at home, Kürten sought solace in the streets, where he found kinship among petty criminals and misfits. It was here that he honed his skills in thievery and violence, a means of survival in a world that had abandoned him. But it was his chilling confession of his first slaying at the age of 9 that foreshadowed the horrors to come. Pushing a helpless schoolmate into a river, he watched as 2 lives were snuffed out in a single act of cruelty, dismissed as tragic accidents by oblivious authorities. And so, Peter Kürten, consumed by darkness, unleashed his reign of terror upon the unsuspecting streets of Dusseldorf, forever staining them with the blood of his victims. As the tendrils of darkness tightened their grip around Peter Kürten's soul, his descent into madness knew no bounds. The streets of Dusseldorf became his hunting ground, where he stalked his prey with a chilling precision, reveling in the fear he instilled in those unlucky enough to cross his path. But it was not just his insatiable thirst for blood that set him apart. It was the sheer brutality of his methods, the savagery with which he tore apart his victims, that earned him the title of the Dusseldorf Monster. Each slaying was a symphony of terror that left an indelible mark on the city and its inhabitants. Kürten claimed to have committed his first slaying in November 1899. In his 1930 confessions to investigators, Kürten claimed to have picked up an 18-year-old girl at the Alléestrasse and persuaded her to accompany him to the Hofgarten. There, he claimed to have engaged in intimate relations with the girl before strangling her into unconsciousness with his bare hands before leaving the scene, believing her to be lifeless. No contemporaneous records exist to corroborate Kürten's claims. If this attack did take place, the victim likely survived this attack. Nonetheless, Kürten later stated that via his committing this act, he had proven to himself that the greatest heights of physical ecstasy could only be achieved in this manner. First convictions. In 1900, Kürten was finally arrested, but only for fraud. Rearrested later the same year on the same charge, although this time for his 1899 Dusseldorf thefts, plus the attempted slaying of a girl with a firearm, were added to the indictment. Hence, Kürten was sentenced to 4 years' imprisonment in October 1900. Released in the summer of 1904, Kürten was drafted into the Imperial German Army, although he soon deserted. That autumn, Kürten began committing acts of arson, which he would discreetly watch from a distance as emergency services attempted to extinguish the fires. The majority of these fires were in barns and haylofts, and Kürten would admit to police he had committed around 24 acts of arson upon his arrest that New Year's Eve. He also freely admitted these fires had been committed both for his physical gratification and in the hope of burning sleeping tramps
Not done afterwards is murder their child, because that is psycho. Why would you assume that is an insane assumption? Eventually, the poor man was cleared of suspicion, but to see him squirm put a huge grin on the face of the actual killer, a true sociopath, finding amusement in the suffering and misery of others. 2 months later, the vampire struck again, another break-in, another burglary attempt, and Peter Curtin.
How many of his victims survived? Curtin was a lot like Richard Ramirez in several ways. Richard Ramirez was also known as the Night Stalker. Both would attack men and women. Both were extremely violent and sadistic, even for serial.
The abused children often displayed disturbed forms of attachment and abnormal emotional responses for the rest of their lives. Attachment disorders look
Vampire of Dusseldorf. This victim led the police to Curtin's apartment. Curtin was not at home at the time, but he saw the police in the hallway and departed from the area. Curtin eventually confessed to his wife that he was the vampire of Dusseldorf. He told her to turn him in to collect.
Eyes. Despair has its own calms. While in custody, Peter Curtin admitted to every single atrocity that he had committed, both to the crimes that the police had already suspected him of and to the ones they had no idea he had done. 68 crimes in total, including 9 murders, 31 attempted murders. He told them everything. He made no excuses for his crimes. He made it clear that he did everything for his own monstrous sexual gratification, and the sight of blood of his innocent victims stimulated him in ways that
did not report the incident to the police. She didn't want the shame and label of being a rape victim. She instead wrote to a friend of hers and told her what had happened. However, she had put the wrong address on the letter, and the post office worker opened the letter to try to get it to the correct person. But after reading it, the panicked postal worker
Curtin was tried and convicted of desertion by the military court, in addition to multiple counts of arson, robbery, and attempted robbery, and was jailed from 1905 to 1913. Curtin served his sentence in Munster, with much of his time spent in solitary confinement for repeated instances of insubordination. He would later claim to investigators and psychologists this period of incarceration was that in which he first encountered severe forms of discipline, and as such, the erotic fantasies he had earlier developed while incarcerated in Derendorf expanded to include graphic fantasies of his striking out at society and slaying masses of people. These fantasies had become ever more paramount and overbearing in his mind, and Curtin later claimed that he derived the sort of pleasures from these visions that other people would get from thinking about a naked woman, adding that he occasionally spontaneously ejaculated while preoccupied with such thoughts. Adolescence. Despite imprisonment and multiple brushes with the law, Peter Curtin's insatiable thirst for violence and depravity remained unquenched. Released from the confines of prison, he roamed the streets once more, a vampire in search of his next victim. In a twisted game of cat and mouse, Curtin's atrocities reached new heights. Arson became his weapon of choice, each blaze a testament to his unbridled rage and desire for destruction. The sight of flames dancing in the night sky brought him a sickening pleasure, a perverse satisfaction that fueled his darkest fantasies. But it was not just buildings and property that fell victim to his madness. With each passing day, his lust for blood grew stronger, his need for violence more insatiable. And so, he set his sights on the innocent. The slaying of Christine Klein, a 9-year-old girl, in her own bed, marked a turning point in Curtin's reign of terror. Strangling, then slashing her, he pleasured himself as her life slipped away, reveling in the power he held over his victim, his twisted desires reaching new heights of depravity. And as her life slipped away, he knew that he had found his true calling, a slayer without remorse, a monster without conscience. The next day, Curtin chose to return to Cologne to drink in a tavern located across the street where he had slayed Klein, so that he could listen to the locals' reactions to the little girl's slaying. He would later recall to investigators that he derived an extreme sense of gratification from the general disgust, repulsion, and outrage he had heard in the patrons' conversations. Moreover, in the weeks following Klein's funeral, Curtin occasionally traveled to Mulheim am Rhein to visit the child's grave, adding that when he handled the soil covering the grave, he spontaneously pleasured himself, happily ever after. On the ominous date of July 14th, Curtin found himself in the clutches of the law once again. Arrested for a string of arson attacks and burglaries, he was swiftly sentenced to 6 years behind bars. However, his rebellious nature and repeated acts of defiance within prison walls led to an extension of his incarceration by an additional 2 years. Confined to a military prison in the town of Brieg, then part of the German Empire, Curtin's days were shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. Finally released from the confines of prison in April 1921, Curtin sought solace in Altenburg, where he took refuge with his sister. It was here that fate led him to Auguste Scharf, a woman 3 years his senior with a troubled past. Scharf, a former hooker who had once been convicted of a fatal shooting, crossed paths with Curtin through his sister. Initially, Curtin concealed his dark history, presenting himself as an army veteran to win her affection. 2 years later, the pair exchanged vows, but behind closed doors, their union was tainted by Curtin's sinister desires. Though they engaged in physical intimacy, Curtin confessed that his true satisfaction came from fantasies of violence against others, leaving their marriage haunted by shadows of darkness. For the first time in his tumultuous life, Curtin found stability in regular employment, assuming the role of a trades union official. Yet despite his newfound routine, he remained isolated, forming no close bonds beyond his marriage. In 1925, the couple returned to the streets of Dusseldorf, where Curtin's sinister tendencies resurfaced. Engaging in illicit affairs with a servant girl named Tieda and a housemaid named Mek, he subjected them to twisted acts of partial strangulation, as he would repeatedly tell them, "That's what love means." Eventually, his wife discovered his infidelity, and his lovers reported him to the authorities, landing him in jail once more. Stay tuned for part 2 of the riveting crimes of the real-life German serial vampire. Signing off for now. Tune in next time for another riveting episode.